Welcome to my channel Fanlit with Anushwa. In today's video, I'm going to discuss modern age in English literature, the context, techniques and movements. Okay, there will be 2 lectures on modern age in English literature since we have a lot of things to cover. So in lecture 1, in today's lecture, which is the lecture 1, we will be discussing context, techniques and movements, okay, of the modern age. So let's begin. Modernism, at first we need to understand about what is modernism, okay. So modernism was a 20th century literary movement which was driven by a conscious desire to overturn all the traditional modes of representation in both prose and poetry, okay. Basically, modernism was a reaction against the Enlightenment philosophy of reason, logicality, and the Victorian notion of high culture with its seriousness, with its orthodox outlook and the representation of reality. Because modernism actually was a consequence or rather was influenced by some of the socio-political, economic and philosophical events at the time which make the modernist writers, thinkers and artists to break away from the traditional norm of representation. Modernism, on the other hand, sought to express the new sensibilities of its time and the consequent feeling of uncertainties through their experimental forms and contents. Because as Ezra Pound had said, to make it new. So modernism's final urge was to make it new. Now what does that it represent? The it represent to make a new perspective of literature and art, to make a new representation of literature and art. Because they believe that the previous way of representation and the thematic concerns and structure are a part of a social realism with which they want to break away themselves, okay, because they were totally disillusioned with the reality represented so far through the Enlightenment philosophy, later extended by the Victorianism and its notion of progress, prosperity. But modernism had witnessed a lot of socio-political chaos, economic crisis. Therefore, the notion of meaning, the notion of culture, the notion of reality itself was completely shattered in modernism. And modernism tried to understand life, tried to understand the meaning of meaning itself from the perspective of their contemporary events, from their philosophical quest for a meaning, okay. So modernism, we can see, is a kind of a literary movement which breaks away from the traditional modes of representation of life, representation of characters, representation of the narrative, which were linear, which does have a plot including an introduction and middle and an ending, usually a happy ending mostly. Apart from the tragedies, usually the previous traditional modes of writing used to have a happy ending, heroic characters, the theme of love, either the objectivity of the social reality or the subjectivity of human emotions. So modernism believed that life does not seem to be as real as it was so far represented in the previous literature and art. Therefore, they constantly broke away from the reality so far represented in the traditional mode of writing, especially in the Victorian text, okay, and also in the writings produced in the age of Enlightenment, because they believed that reality which was depicted in those literature was only a partial reality, was only a product of a class consciousness, of a social ideology which they want to question. Now, we need to understand why modernism started questioning all these aspects of culture, heroism and questioning meaning itself. So what happened during the socio-political time relating to modernism that made modernism totally disillusioned with the traditional culture, traditional literature, and the traditional artistic form? In order to know that, we need to dig deep. Okay, so in this particular picture, you can see that the human life is represented. Okay, we can see here, I just zoom it out. You can see here two men. These men are the representative of the modern men, but in this picture, we cannot see the real men as it appeared to be, but the reality is represented with some twist in modernism. Okay, so we will be finding out the twist in course of the entire discussion, but we need to first understand why modernism was totally disillusioned with the contemporary representation of literature and culture. Okay, so here in this particular slide, I will be discussing about the context of modern literature. Okay, modernism actually insisted an intellectual query to look upon and find the meaning of existence, and its validity to look through the lens of civilization, progress, culture, gender, and its obvious binaries. So modernism started with an investigation. Modernism started to find out the meaning of existence. And modernism started to question the notion of civilization, progress, culture, gender, and the binaries which is related to all this stuff. Because whenever we try to describe civilization, we always discriminate the civilized and the uncivilized, the progressive and the backwards, culture and the primitivity, gender, okay, and subjugativeness, okay, suppressiveness. So this is how, while we are discussing gender, we used to discuss about men and women. So we used to binarize everything. We used to draw everything with stark opposition, with opposites, okay. But modernism started questioning all this meaning of existence, all this meaning of civilization, progress, culture, gender, and all the binaries used to describe all these aspects. Now, why so? Because modernism actually came out as a kind of response of the two world wars. Okay, the First World War and the Second World War, which brought about a large-scale human cry, loss of life, violence, the shattering of economy, and the Victorian narrative of progress, peace, and prosperity. Right? So modernism was disillusioned with the so far narration of progress, prosperity, and peace culture, with the breaking out of the two world wars, the cultural upheavals in the colonies, and the philosophical questioning of the triumvirates like Karl Marx, Siegmund Freud, and Nietzsche, also with the Great Depression in the aftermath of the World War, okay, that resulted in lot of unemployment, poverty, the crisis of life itself, where there were a lot of struggle for existence. Okay, so with regard to this, when the modernist people had witnessed the two world war, the loss of life, the notion of peace and prosperity altogether shattered, they were disillusioned, because initially First World War happened with the reason almost like to establish peace and order. But what they saw, what they witnessed in the name of peace and order was totally chaos, was totally violence, what totally the loss of generation. So this is how modernism started questioning the validity of human existence. That what does it mean that we exist? Do we exist through our ideas? Do we exist through our deeds? Do we exist through our queries? So modernism used to question all these aspects. Now, why the questions were raised in the modernist thinkers? Because they have witnessed poverty during the Great Depression period, the large-scale violence in the two world wars, and of course their questioning was triggered by the Marxist philosophy of class consciousness, in which Karl Marx had elaborately discussed that how the meanings are produced in the context of a capitalistic culture. Then we find Siegmund Freud, how Siegmund Freud tried to exemplify that how through our conscious mind we are almost suppressing our subconscious understanding and perception, and this is how the meanings are created. And Nietzsche discussed that how the entire Western canon of philosophy seemed to focus only on the social aspects and undermine the individualistic urge of self-expression. So all this atmosphere, both the socio-political upheaval during and in the aftermath of the World War, the Great Depression, and the philosophical queries of Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Nietzsche completely shattered the foundation of civilization, culture, and the meaning of meaning itself. Okay. Therefore, the modernist people try to understand and decode the meaning of meaning in the context of capitalism, so psychoanalysis, and radical questioning, following the footsteps of Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. And what they discovered was that each and every word has its association with some of the socio-political and the economic condition, with the psychological subjugation of the subconscious, and the cultural repressiveness, okay, of the underprivileged section of the society by the privileged. And this is how the meanings are formed. This is how the society was created. This is how the notion of civilization was established. So modernism was totally disillusioned with all these aspects of life, and they found that existence itself is questionable, because the existence means both the physical existence as well as that of the psychological existence. And since we are continuously in a process of physical and social subjugation by the privileged section of the society, and the psychological subjugation by our own conscious mind, therefore, what is identity? Right? What is self? What is society? What is individual? What is gender? They started questioning all these aspects, right? So, the impact of First World War. What was the impact of First World War upon the modern age in literature? So, First World War seemed to shatter the so-called narratives of peace, progress, and prosperity, reflected in the 19th century optimism of Victorian literature. First World War brought a sense of disillusionment with the ideals that appeared to be superficial and outdated in the face of the large-scale violence and loss of life. During this particular period of time, a writer and a critic, Gertrude Stein, had coined the term lost generation, which was later popularized by Ernest Hemingway in his novel The Sun Also Rises. So, Gertrude Stein, by the term lost generation, means to refer to the disoriented, wandering, and directionless spirit of the war survivors in the early interwar period. Now, what does this term lost generation indicate? Lost generation means a generation who was either psychologically lost after witnessing the trauma of the First World War, or their lives were lost in the war front, as we can see or read in the poems of Wilfred Owen, okay, or in Siegfried Sassoon. Or the lost generation also implicated a generation whose identity is lost in the social process of war, the so-called peacemaking, the so-called prosperity, and in their regular combat with the Great Depression. Okay, so the lost generation indicates a generation which arises during the war years, during the interwar period, and in the post-war period, who tried to seek meaning and their identity in their contemporary world of constant chaos, constant adversities, and constant struggles for existence, right? Now, the impact of Second World War. See, the First World War created a havoc. The First World War was almost like a shock in the so-called linearity of life, which was based on the industrial progress. Okay, but the Second World War was something that rather fueled the intensity of disillusionment which the people had already experienced in the First World War. Okay, so First World War caused disillusionment, but the Second World War caused a kind of cynicism. Now, why so? Because when the First World War happened, it was almost like a shock. People were leading a comparatively peaceful life with the notion of progress during the Industrial Revolution. So they did not imagine any such thing that can totally make their life topsy-turvy. Okay, for example, when we read The Lotus Eaters by Somerset Maugham, so at that period of time, we know that the narrator had described, while describing about the life of Capri, he also stated, okay, that the First World War happened and it totally changed their lives altogether. So First World War had caused the change, had caused the systematic change in the society, which in turn systematically changed the inner psychology of a human being, their perception, their understanding of life, their existence, okay, and the literature that used to represent human life, existence, culture, and civilization so far. And that was the reason modernism actually break away from all those traditions, because they had believed whatever we have read so far was a lie, was probably a partial truth, or probably was not a truth at all. It was probably a partial representation of reality, or probably not. So modernism indicates a kind of a confusion, a kind of a chaos that happened all of a sudden in their life during the First World War. But when the Second World War happened, okay, the society had already witnessed the destruction of First World War. So when they saw that after witnessing this much of destruction in the First World War, if the political thinkers still prefer a Second World War, then what is the validity of life? Then what is the validity of culture? Not to question about the notion of civilization itself. Therefore, they tried to, the Second World War period actually reached towards a kind of a psychological cynicism, towards a kind of a social cynicism. Okay, because they had seen the economic collapses, they had seen the darker aspects, that how we the human beings are so much hungry after power that we do not hesitate to kill, we do not hesitate to make an end of a civilization, and we can go to any extreme for that. So the meaning, culture, value, all this socially established moral systems, the moral code of conduct seemed completely valueless during the Second World War. So, if First World War coincided with modernism, Second World War led to the postmodern aspects of alienation, psychological trauma, and a celebration of fragmentation. While modernism tried to find and understand the meaning of meaning, postmodernism cared a damn about meaning. Postmodernism understood that life has no meaning and the meanings are arbitrary. The meanings are produced in terms of the socio-cultural changes in accordance with the need of the privileged section of the society. Therefore, care a damn about meaning. We celebrate the meaninglessness of existence, and therefore during the Second World War, during the rise of the postmodernism, we can see the techniques like absurdism, expressionism, the techniques of pastiche, irony, intertextuality, that of parody, etc., that used to celebrate the crash of culture, that used to celebrate the void of life, that used to celebrate the meaninglessness of life. Unless modernism, which tried to understand the meaning of life, which sought to understand where is the meaning of life and existence, postmodernism accepted that life has no meaning, therefore no need to find it out. Just celebrate the chaos. Just accept the chaos into which you live. This is how the human identities are formed, out of chaos. This is how the human identities are shaped in terms of the need of others. And while modernism searched for a universal truth, okay, postmodernism did not at all bother about any truth, because they believe the notion of truth, the notion of reality, is very much arbitrary and is a product of a culture, is a product of a system, it's a product of a generation. And therefore there is no such thing as reality, as truth. The only truth is that each and every individual reflects his or her individuality in their own specific kind of way, and therefore there is no such thing as universal truth, because I can respond to a situation in my way and my response will be definitely different from some other. So postmodernism, and during the impact of the Second World War, which created this postmodernistic urge of cynicism, a complete disillusionment, they used to celebrate all the subjective emotions, the subjective actions, okay, the subjective actions which is assigned with a kind of an absurdism, because we are trying to find out meaning in a world which itself is meaningless. So postmodern hold that particular idea that human existence is essentially absurd, because we are trying to understand meaning or find meaning in a world which itself is meaningless, which itself is a production of a culture in accordance with the need of a privileged society. Okay, therefore in postmodern literature we completely find a breakaway from all the conventional techniques which we already found in modernism, right? So if the First World War led to modernism, the Second World War led to postmodernism. Postmodernism was an advancement of modernism and was a contrast of modernism. Modernism tried to find out the meaning, okay, of all the culture and civilization, because they believed that their understanding, the way they understood life, civilization, culture, gender, progress, prosperity, heroism, all these meanings were totally blurred. So modernism captured the blurring of their perception, and modernism tried to find out an alternative meaning by adopting the alternative techniques, tenets in their writing. Whereas postmodernism understood no meaning exists at all, therefore they celebrated the fragmentation, the alienation, the absurd human behavior, okay, and these were basically the aspects of modern and postmodern. Now there is Great Depression. So Great Depression worldwide was an economic downturn that began in the 1929 and it lasted about 1939. It was characterized by a high rates of unemployment, poverty, drastic reductions in industrial production and international trade that shattered both the notion of Victorian optimism and the American dream. Okay, what is American dream? In precise, I just try to explain. American dream, very much like that of the Victorian optimism, try to believe that America is a place of prosperity where there is a lot of opportunity for economic progress, for a subjective development of an individual. Okay, as in the Victorian optimism, in the poems like Ulysses, we find the similar temperament, that is to strive, to seek, to find and not to yield. So American dream was very much akin to that. But during the Great Depression period, while the destruction of the two world wars, all this understanding of optimism and dream of progress, peace, and prosperity totally shattered. Now, Sigmund Freud's idea of sublimation. How Sigmund Freud played a vital role in shaping the modernistic and the postmodernistic literary endeavors. Okay, so Sigmund Freud, basically at first I will try to explain what is sublimation. Then I will try to explain how Sigmund Freud investigated sublimation. So sublimation, according to Sigmund Freud, is a defense mechanism through which we try to channelize our unacceptable social impulses and energies like our sexual urges, our primitive desire for fight, our primitive desires for hunger, uncontrolled hunger, anything which the moral code of the society would cancel outright. Okay, so Sigmund Freud said that sublimation is a defense mechanism through which we try to channelize our this unwanted energies like sexuality, violence, etc. through art, science, sports, okay, in order to cope with the expected social norms. So sublimation is a process through which we actually kind of repress our subconscious anxieties, our subconscious thinking, potentiality, expectation, everything through the form of art, science, sports, etc. But not to act accordingly with the subconscious anxiety. Rather, we try to act smart, we try to act with following all the moral codes of the society by subjugating our subconscious and channelizing our subconscious desires and energies like sexuality, violence, anxiety, crisis, jealousy, fear through art, through science, through sports, etc. Okay, so sublimation is a process of the conscious mind's subjugation of the subconscious thought. We know that we also have this kind of feeling sometimes. Sometimes we fear that we may lose our position in an organization, in the hierarchy of a family. Sometimes we do have the anxiety. Okay, sometimes we feel the uncertainty, and sexuality is a necessary human urge. But these things the society do not want us to say explicitly in front of the people. Okay, so sublimation is a process through which we suppress all the subconscious desires, anxieties and fears by our conscious mind and let it express. Okay, we let all these fears, anxiety, love, sexual desire, we let it express through art, science and sports. Okay, in a codified way, because we are afraid of stating it very outright in the public. Okay, because this is not very much in association with the moral code that the society provided to us. Therefore, Sigmund Freud investigated the inner realm of psyche. Sigmund Freud said that human consciousness is constantly suppressing the subconscious realization, the subconscious instinctual desire, and this is how the civilization is formed. Therefore, what we call as civilization was nothing but a negation of the subconscious self by the conscious self. Then how can we validate such civilization? Therefore, civilization is based on a partial truth. Civilization portrays the partial reality. Morality constantly intervenes into the process of civilization. Morality constantly intervenes into the process of our own conscious mind and make the conscious mind subjugate the subconscious fear, anxiety and desire. And this is how the civilizations were created. The cultures were created. Then what is the validity of that culture and civilization where an individual has to deny his own self, his own fear, his own anxiety, his own sexual urges, and only represent only the good sides of himself or herself? then this civilization itself is false. This culture itself is false. Okay. So this is how Sigmund Freud questioned the very idea of civilization and culture, which is based on a psychoanalytic approach of sublimation. Next, false consciousness and radical questioning. False consciousness is a part of a Marxist discourse. False consciousness is a state of mind which is created by the capitalistic system through its institution and dominant ideologies that prevent the working class from recognizing that society is treating them with injustice. For example, all of us have probably read that of Freedom by George Bernard Shaw. And in that particular essay, George Bernard Shaw had elaborately discussed this particular point of false consciousness. Because probably through newspapers, the democracy is celebrated. Probably through the notion of heroism and martyrdom, war is celebrated. Okay. Probably in the name of women as Devi, Dashabhuja, Durga, okay, we celebrate the feminine limitations and we confine the women within the domestic periphery and we exploit the women and make them obliged to do multiple things at a single point of time by glorifying her as goddess Durga, having all 10 hands, can do anything, okay, by creating this Dashabhuja narrative. So this is how false consciousness is a process through which, either through the newspapers, through the advertisements, through the institutions like school or any other religious institution, you are taught that it is natural to act like this. And why so? Because all these institutions are a part of a capitalist culture that definitely want to shape a working class mind in such a way that we will always look for a job, a service and beg for it instead of creating our own business, instead of creating our own independent economic, social and political identity, instead of protesting against all the injustices and uniting to improve it. We find that this system, this is the eternal system, this is truth. And we do not ever protest against any kind of oppression, be it in the workplace, be it in the families, in terms of gender binaries, be it in the nation-state affair. And therefore, Karl Marx said that the false consciousness were created into the mind of the individuals so that we cannot protest against the social injustices that is happening to the working class people because we find it to be normal. Okay, the makeup is in such a way that we find the injustice to be normal, as we find that working for 8 to 10 hours is normal. Okay, the women who have to do both the office works and the homework, the works in the household, it's normal. We find that not to question the governmental policies and ideas is normal. Okay, and this is how we are accepting everything as normal and we forget to protest. This is how meanings are created of culture, of civilization. Karl Marx analyzed the social and economic process that creates the hierarchical power and laid bare the idea of false consciousness in which the privileged social class rationalize their own social system. They fabricate their social system in which the privileged class will be more privileged. And they fabricate this social system and they put it into the mind of the working class people through institutions like schools, religious institution, okay, through that of news channels, through advertisements, by using mass media. And this is how they create, as Louis Althusser said, the ideological coercion. As I told you, that is the celebration of war in the name of martyrdom and heroism, and cultural hegemony by Antonio Gramsci, in which certain ideas were presented in such a way that it seemed to be absolutely natural to us. For example, you know that all of us have witnessed the fairness products and its advertisement, and what we have seen that there was a fair woman and a dark skinned woman. Okay, a woman with a lighter skin tone and a woman with a darker skin tone. So the lighter skin tone woman, she was celebrated, she became the center of attraction, and everybody used to focus her. While the darker skin tone women, she used to feel invisible, alienated, and therefore she nurtured the urge to look like exactly that of the fair women. And this is where the capitalism launches its product, that take this particular cream and be fair within these few weeks. Okay, so this is how fairness has become the standard of beauty. Okay, heroism has become the standard of masculinity. Sacrifice and motherhood had become the standard of femininity. This is how the culture used to impart meaning as per the need of either the capitalistic culture as described by Karl Marx, or that of the conscious want of the social morality as described by Siegmund Freud, where the conscious mind, which is framed out of the social morality of some capitalistic culture, used to subjugate, okay, that of the subconscious mind. Now, Nietzsche identified a falsity in the entire Western canon of metaphysics, from Socrates, Christianity, and Enlightenment, because Nietzsche believed that all these philosophical ideas used to emphasize an inner separation of an individual and used to emphasize the social aspects. And this is how the human identity, the human subjectivity is always sacrificed, is always under the threat, okay, by the society's interference. And society means obviously the privileged section. If it is a time of monarchy, the monarchs were the privileged section. So they used to decide the social norms and moral condition. If it is the time of the modernity, then all the capitalists used to design the social norms and moral codes, and we, the foolish individuals, are accepting it as normal because we were made to believe that it is normal by the institutions like school, jail, by the institution like religious institution, by the media, and we accept it as normal and we try to act it. Okay, we try to act up to the expectation of either this monarchical culture or this capitalistic culture. And this is how we, the individuals, are shaping our conscious mind and subjugate our subconscious fears, anxiety, and constant rebellion against the society's influence into the individual's personal domain. Okay, so modernism was shaped out of all these philosophical queries. Now here, Karl Marx decoded how the society creates particular system and how we are accepting meaning, how we can mean that man means bravery, women means submissiveness, how we are associating white with purity and black with evil. So if a man's complexion is black, is he evil? No. This is how the society made him look up to himself. That if you are black, that means you are evil, but it is not. Isn't it? So this is how the meanings were given. This is how the meanings were produced. So Karl Marx analyzed the process of this meaning making, the process of building civilization, the process of creating culture on the basis of the socio-economic condition of capitalism, where the privileged section used to decide everything, how the society's culture and mindset would be. Sigmund Freud exactly make us understand how we, the human beings, are as a part of that society's hierarchy, shape our conscious mind in such a way that we have to make the society happy, and by making the society happy, we are negating our subconscious mind. And this is how the civilization is created, this is how the literature were produced. It's just to celebrate human endeavors, but which did not even discuss the psychological conflict. And whenever they discuss it in a very codified language. Okay, Nietzsche questioned the philosophical canon, the metaphysics, the question of the ideal itself, which again subjugates the individual urges. So modernism or modern age in literature had witnessed not only the social upheavals in terms of the world war, but modernism had also found the explanation how the civilization, culture, gender and all these meanings were created by the critical thinkers like Karl Marx, Siegmund Freud, Nietzsche, that they were totally disillusioned with the tradition. I hope now you understand why modernism were totally disillusioned with the tradition, because they believed that each and everything were man-made. Each and everything were made by a culture. The culture which always emphasized the privileged section of the society, be it a monarch, be it an aristocrat, be it a capitalist bourgeois. Okay, therefore, modernism used to look for meaning. Modernism was a desperate arch to find meaning. Okay. Modernism tried to understand that meaning, what is the source of meaning, what to look at. Now here comes things fall apart. Okay, so in a nutshell, all the technological advancement of the 19th century, the rapid social changes, the immense human cry of the world wars, and the philosophical questioning of the critical thinkers like Marx, Sigmund Freud, Nietzsche, totally resulted in a break from the mainstream narratives of happily ever after, bliss, progress, heroism and revelation. So modernist thinkers were totally disillusioned with all these narratives of happily ever after, progress and heroism. Instead, now modernism reflected the collapses of the center from which the meanings were so far produced, circulated and consumed. Now modernism were able to identify how the meanings were created out of a center. Now the center means the privileged section of the society, who used to determine the meaning, who used to circulate the meaning through their institutions, and we, the poor, restless, the wretched individuals, used to consume those meanings through our reading books, through the advertisements, through the movies, okay, through the rituals. We are accepting and consuming the meaning which were produced by the center, the privileged section of the society, for their own benefit. Therefore, modernism wanted to replace that center. Modernism wanted to produce and write literature that won't talk about the privileged section of the society. Instead, that would talk about the new meanings found by the individuals during and after the war period. The meanings of crisis, the meanings of struggle for existence, the meaning of being spiritually lost and barren, the meaning of our restlessness, that how we are restless to hold a culture, but we find nothing to hold. And this is exactly what W.B. Yeats described in his poem, The Second Coming, that things fall apart, the center cannot hold. So when all this political, social and philosophical questioning came up, the privileged section of the society no longer was able to hold its influence upon, definitely not only in terms of the society, upon the creative art. In the creative movement like modernism, we used to depict the crash of this privileged center and found that probably there is no meaning of meaning. The meanings are arbitrary. The meanings are produced, but still they constantly try to find out a unity They constantly try to find out a meaning in the meaninglessness of life, which postmodernism totally denied. Modernism was a desperate urge to find a metaphysical center where understanding that it is impossible to have a center, because whenever we try to create a center of meaning, okay, the privileged section of the society will always mold it as per their own needs. Therefore, modernism was trying to look meaning, trying to find unity among the chaos, and in order to do this, modernism break away from the traditional method. Modernism created its own method, created its own characteristics. For example, if Victorian age was characterized with optimism, social realism, romanticism was characterized with subjective expression of emotion, modernism was characterized with fragmentation, okay, with stream of consciousness technique, with parody, okay, in order to capture their understanding of reality, which was different from the Enlightenment and the Victorian understanding of reality, because they no longer believed into the meaning, civilization, culture and heroism which were so far established by the Enlightenment philosophy and the Victorian culture, right? Now, contrast with Romanticism. So in this regard, you may probably think that both modernism and Romanticism, they were a reaction against the system of reason and logicality, okay, of the 18th century logicality in the case of Romanticism, and the Victorian reason and logicality in the case of modernism. Okay, as Romanticism was a reaction against the Enlightenment philosophy of reason and the emphasis of the society and undermining individuality, modernism too was a response against the Victorian reality, the Victorian reason and rationality. Okay, so there is a similarity between modernism and romanticism. Both modernism and romanticism want to capture the subjective inner world of an individual. And both modernism and romanticism were disillusioned with reality. Both modernism and romanticism were disgusted with the reality, where romanticism was a total escape from reality into the world of imagination. Romanticism holds the perception that there is a meaning in the universal truth, but that universal truth is beyond the sensory world. The universal truth, the romanticists identify in the form of divinity, which they found in nature. So, in the case of romanticism, they found meaning in a higher world, the world which is beyond this real physical world. But modernism did not find meaning in a higher world. Modernism does not believe in any such higher world. Modernism failed to find meaning in any world, and therefore modernism suggested a non-rational sense of meaning which is arbitrary. But still, modernism on one hand understood that it is impossible to find a meaning, but still they were looking for meaning. Okay, modernism, they understood that meanings were a production of a culture, of a privileged section of society, but still they tried to unify all those scattered cultural aspects and try to find out if there will be any organic unity. Okay, so modernism was a desperate urge to hold something, okay, with the realization that things fall apart, and postmodernism wants to celebrate that there is no center, there is no meaning. So let's celebrate the meaninglessness and nonsense, right? Now, early modern techniques. Now, what are the characteristics of modern literature? First, modern literature is characterized with fragmentation. Fragmentation means the breaking apart of a cohesive narrative. In modern literature, we do not find out a proper narrative technique. the quote-unquote proper narrative technique. Modern literature used to portray the complexity of life, the philosophical ideas, traditional values, social order. Okay, without that, modernism wants to establish or hold the chaos, the instability, and the uncertainty of the contemporary world. As you can see in this particular photo, you can see the fragments. There is watch, there is shoe, fruits. It seems like how the human being's identity and life is assembled into this picture. Okay, the shoes probably symbolize the human beings. Okay, the watch probably indicates time. The fruits probably indicate that of the habit. So this is how this fragmented picture represents that how the individual life is conditioned by time and creates the human habits. Okay, so as I try to find out the meaning of this fragmented picture, out of this fragmented picture, this is how modernism tried to find out the meaning out of this fragmented world. Okay, I hope I made you understand. The modernist authors employed this fragmentation in order to shape and give significance to the contemporary fragmented reality. Okay, because they believe that the society is fragmented. The way we used to represent individual as good, as bad, modernists believe that there is no such thing. An individual is part of his or her social ambience, the socio-economic condition, and the conflict between his conscious and subconscious mind. Therefore, an individual identity is fragmented, and when the human life is fragmented, when we are constantly playing roles, for example, when we are in home, we are a different person. When we go to our workplace, we are a different person. When we go to with our friends and very dear ones, we are a different persons. That means our identity is fragmented, it's part. And when we assemble all these parts together, it gives us a complete picture that no human being is having one particular type. No human life is linear. Life sometimes is about sunshine, sometimes is about thunderstorms, sometimes is about nothing of both sunshine and thunderstorms. Okay, so this is how modernism wants to capture the fragmentation, almost like that of a jigsaw puzzle. We know what is jigsaw puzzle. Okay, we have to assemble all the parts of the puzzle and try to create a complete picture. So modernists use this fragmented technique and they try to assemble the society and find a meaning out of this fragmented reality. Because the world and the social condition have totally fragmented their belief, their existence, everything. Therefore, modernist writers used to capture this fragmented existence and identity of the contemporary individual through fragmented narratives like stream of consciousness and interior monologues. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and T.S. Eliot's Hollow Man, okay, we can see this idea of fragmentation where we can see, I think most of us have read probably the Hollow Man. So in Hollow Man, I do have a video on Hollow Man. I will give the link in the description box. Those who have not seen the video, you can watch the video. So in the Hollow Man, what we find is that Eliot pointed out the modern world, okay, by creating 5 pictures. In one picture, the Hollow Man is acting irrational. In one picture, the Hollow Man is afraid of a divine revelation. In another picture, we feel the Hollow Man is waiting for a divine revelation, but is afraid of accepting it. In another picture, we find that the Hollow Man is trying to say something, but they cannot. They try to move, but they cannot. In another picture, we find that the Hollow Man is doing a mockery, a self-mockery. So this is how T.S. Eliot, through these 5 parts, had tried to capture the entirety through the part in his poem, The Hollow Man. So, fragmentation is almost like the part for the whole. okay, where we can see only the whole when we can assemble it through the parts. This is how modern literature used to capture the fragmentation of human existence, because the world war had fragmented human existence, human belief, human ideologies, human culture, and human civilization. And through fragmentation, modernism tried to find out the meaning. Next, unreliable narrators. Okay, another important characteristic of modernist writing is the use of unreliable narrator. Now, this particular term, unreliable narrator, was coined by Wayne C. Booth in his book, The Rhetoric of Fiction. What does this unreliable narrator mean? The narrator who tells lies, sometimes who conceals information, who misjudges information in respect to the narrative audience. Now, what is the narrative audience? Narrative audience means, suppose I am a character, I am giving information to another character in the same story, in the same play, in the same novel. So, I am giving a misinformation either consciously or without knowledge, but that audience, okay, within the story's framework is given a wrong information. So this is called unreliable narrator. Therefore, unreliable narrator means a narrator who tells lies, who conceals information, who places a wrong judgment to the narrative audience within the story itself. The narrative audience means, in My Last Duchess, okay, the envoy is the narrative audience, is an example of a narrative audience who is listening, okay. The character who is listening is the narrative audience, okay. And the unreliable narrator is the one who narrates an event, but either telling lie, either concealing information, either misjudging or misinterpreting any incident. Now, the difference is that we, the actual audience, can understand that the unreliable narrator is passing a wrong information, but the narrative audience fails to realize that we are provided with a wrong information. Now, why this kind of complicated technique of narration happens in modernism? Because with these technicalities, modernism wants to capture the disillusionment, and they want to break away with the image of an artist as reliable interpreter and representative of the mainstream bourgeois culture and idea. So, unreliable narrator was a kind of an antidote to counter the irrationality behind the rational world. Okay, unreliable narrator was a kind of a portraying the reality that not every time what the characters say, what the authors say should be true, because the character and the author who produced the character is part of a social phenomena, okay, the social phenomena which creates meaning, and being a consumer, the author is consuming the meaning produced by the society and is imparting that meaning through his characters, through his writing, and as reader we are accepting the meaning to be true. But when the meaning is arbitrary, then how we can say that whatever the author is writing is true? Whatever the character is speaking is true. Whatever is written in the book is true. Okay, so unreliable narrative breaks away the convention that whatever the author says is true, whatever the character says is true. Okay, so this is how unreliable narrator is a modern technique that breaks away from almost the deification of the author to be true. Okay, I want to exemplify. For example, when we read Ulysses, so what is written there in Ulysses? Old age hath its honor and its toil, right? And we are getting motivated with this particular poem. Yes, old age has its honor and its toil. Now we need to keep in mind one thing, that Tennyson actually produced this text in a socio-economic and historical context of Victorianism, where the society wants the individual to be rejuvenated. But the society, Victorian society, wanted everybody to go beyond the sea, do sea voyages. Okay, and out of the need of the time, Tennyson had written Ulysses to be a man of wisdom through his travel and adventure overseas. And this is how we find the voice of Ulysses as well as Tennyson to be true. But it may not be true when the society is changed. It might be true in the 19th century context, but it may not be true in the 20th century context. So there is no such thing as established truth. Truth, reality, each and everything, meaning each and everything varies. Then how can we say that a narrator is true, an author is true, a text is true? Okay, so this is how unreliable narrator is a technique used by modernist writers to show this particular arbitrariness, this particular instability of truth. Clear? Now, critic William Regan, he categorizes 4 types of unreliable narrators. One is a picaro. Picaro means one who is an anti-hero, okay, who has a rebellious attitude, and therefore his worldview is different. So whenever a picaro is reporting an event as good or bad, we may have to doubt, because we need to understand that he is saying something from a rebellious point of view. Then how his point of view is authentic against a system, right? Another aspect, another type of unreliable narrator discussed by William Regan is a clown. We know that a clown, as we can see in King Lear, okay, as we can see in Fest in Twelfth Night, okay. So the clown is an unreliable narrator because the clown used to speak in ambiguities, okay, in ambiguities, and therefore his understanding or his representation of the reality, his representation of the world might not be always trusted. Next, the madman. The madman, we know that does not have the quote-unquote sanity of mind. Therefore, the madman probably understands the world in his subconscious mind, okay, and represent an incident accordingly, which may not prove true later in course of the event in the text. Another world is the naive or the knave, who is inexperienced and immature. Therefore, their reporting might not always be true. Now, this example I just want to give one example in this regard. That Nora and Kathleen, probably you remember Nora and Kathleen in Riders to the Sea. So, Nora, she told Kathleen that Moria was crying badly on the day of when Michael got missing. Okay, therefore, Moria loved Michael most among all her children. Nora said this to Kathleen. Now, Kathleen was the narrative audience and we are the actual audience. We understand that what Nora is saying to Kathleen is false. Okay, therefore, Nora is there, the unreliable narrator. Kathleen is there, the narrative audience, and we are the actual audience. And we know that whatever Nora is saying, it's because of her immaturity to understand the true character of Moria. She was not able to understand why Moria cried too much on the day when Michael was missing and why she became calm on the death of Barclay. Because Nora was too immature to understand the pain of Moria, the resilience of Moria. Okay, therefore, her narration of Moria's character to Kathleen was a false narration and she was an unreliable narrator. And this is how the modernist writers used to capture that this is the reality. Okay, reality is not always what the Victorian novels picturize. Okay, the character probably have their own falsity, have their own drawback, have their own limitation, and this is how they narrate. Similarly, the author who produced in a system or in a time period, probably his produced meanings are different and may not be relevant in future. Okay, so this is the importance of unreliable narrator, an important aspect of modernistic writing. Next, interior monologue and stream of consciousness technique. Okay, so interior monologue and stream of consciousness technique is developed in the 20th century by some writers who attempted to capture the flow of the character's consciousness rather than interpreting it from a narrator's voice. Okay, so stream of consciousness is a narrative technique, as you can see in the photo. I have also given all the link from the Google images from where I have collected these photos mostly. So in this particular picture you can see a character, okay, is thinking something. And through this particular thinking, the character's inner psychology is revealed. Therefore, stream of consciousness or interior monologue. Now, monologue means conversation. When the characters talk to themselves. Okay, unlike soliloquy where the character talks to the audience. Okay, in an indirect way. Unlike dramatic monologue where the character is talking to another character. Okay, in interior monologue, the character is talking to herself or himself and represents the stream of his or her consciousness. And therefore, there is no need of any narrator to describe what the character is thinking, what the character is feeling. Now, stream of consciousness is very much akin to the asides in the drama. You remember in Macbeth, probably I am giving a very wrong example, not wrong, very unsuitable example. So in Macbeth, we can see there were some aside section. When Macbeth used to think that after the prediction of the witches, when Macbeth used to think aside. Okay, so when Macbeth was thinking within himself, that was interior monologue. Okay, and that exactly showed the stream of consciousness. That is the flow of thought of the characters when the character talked to themselves. Okay, in private, when no narrator is describing whatever the character is thinking and feeling and whatever is happening in the life of the character. Okay, when the character himself or herself, okay, talks to himself or herself in his or her inner space in psychology, and no author, no narrator is describing the events in the character's life. Now, why this particular technique of stream of consciousness? Because by stream of consciousness, we the readers can directly get a glimpse of the character's psychology. Now, what are the features of the stream of consciousness technique? Now, while we are thinking something, can we use comma, full stop, punctuation marks? No, it's like a flow of thought, right? So, stream of consciousness technique is also grammatically incorrect. There is unusual punctuations. There were continuous long sentences where we can see the free association of ideas, etc. Okay, now this particular term, stream of consciousness, was coined by the psychologist William James in The Principles of Psychology. And it was popularized by authors like James Joyce in his novel Ulysses and Virginia Woolf in his Mrs. Dalloway, okay, where they used to capture the character's inner world. Okay, when we read Mrs. Dalloway, we can see Clarissa Dalloway's conflicts and doubts and her constant blurring of present and past. While she is walking presently on the street, her mind is on the past, thinking of how she used to walk in her young ages, followed by her two dear friends. Okay, how she made a wise, quote-unquote, wise decision of marrying a socially established and economically stable man by compromising her love for Peter Welch. Okay, so this is how, through the psychological insight of Clarissa Dalloway, we directly can understand her character without the author's voice and interpretation. Clear? Next, epiphany. Epiphany is another aspect of the modernistic writing. Epiphany means a sudden significant realization which a character experiences and which gives them a deeper understanding of life. In ancient Greek usages, the term epiphany was derived from the term epiphania, which means to bring light. It often used to describe the manifestation of God and goddesses to mortal eyes. Okay, so in Greek usages, epiphany used to describe when God appeared to mortal beings and gave them guidances. So epiphany in the modernist writing used to happen in such a way where the where the characters deviated, okay, from their previous knowledge, and they have their known knowledge. For example, we all read Araby. Probably I do have a video on Araby. I will give the link in the description box. So what happened in Araby, in James Joyce's Araby, we can see that the narrator used to consider Araby as a place of his escape, a place to fulfill all his wishes of communicating with Mangan's sister. But when he reached Araby, when all the lights closed, that point was an epiphany for him, where he understood, he realizes that fancy cannot cheat so well. That means his escape was not possible through Araby. So Araby was not a place to access his fancy for Mangan's sister. Araby was a place which brought him to reality that however hard you try to escape, you cannot escape the situation in which you are placed into. You cannot escape the urgency of the situation you are placed into. You cannot escape the life around you. Okay, so Araby is epiphany is that revelation which the character has in due course of the event, which is a sudden significant realization which makes an end of a previous knowledge and creates a new knowledge. So epiphany is a moment of breaking the previous knowledge and creating the new knowledge. It's a point of breaking and creating together. Clear? Next, multigenre. Multigenre. Now, modern writings and postmodern writings used to combine multiple genres. Okay, we cannot say that any modern text is written in particular genre, like autobiographical fiction. We can see that a modern and postmodern text used to combine multiple genre. Now, why so? Because this hybrid approach served the modernist writer's purpose of challenging the traditional genre classification which characterized the Victorian literature and the literature produced in the earlier era of Enlightenment, of the Romantic period, etc. Since modernist writers want to assert their own individuality, they want to break from the traditional norm, and as Ezra Pound said, to make it new. So modernist writers use fragmentation, stream of consciousness, epiphany and multi-genre in order to challenge the classical genre classification and linearity. Okay, so through the multi-genre literature, the modernist writers used to explore various narrative techniques, styles, and incorporate multiple themes in the single framework of a text. For example, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale blends dystopian fiction with feministic concern in the framework of a science fiction, okay, and it used to address the issue of gender, power, human rights in the 20th century social context. Now, why this multi-genre? Because human life cannot be linear, right? If we are living in a society which is industrially progressive, it does not mean that the industrial progressiveness is the only reality. Okay, apart from that, there is other reality, like the unemployment, like that of the socio-political manipulation, like the gender binaries. So these are also the part of reality. Then how can we capture only one-sided reality in our writing? That was the question of modernist writers. Therefore, they actually represented reality in its multifacetedness. Okay, and therefore, the modernist writings used to be multi-genre, which used to address different social themes like gender, power, human rights, identity crisis by incorporating multiple genres into literature. Okay. Next, late modernism or postmodernism in literature after World War II. So, as I told you, that modernism, if we can consider, was a search for meaning and a unity in a fragmented world. Postmodernism, which happened during the Second World War or after the violence and chaos of the Second World War. So that late modernism and postmodernism, they did not care about meaning, because they found that meaning is arbitrary. There is no meaning of meaning. Okay, therefore what the postmodern technique or the late modern technique emphasized, okay, I will have a different video on postmodernism, but here just I try to explain so that your understanding of modern and postmodern will be clear. Okay, so postmodernism or late modernism emphasized expressionism. Now expressionism was a 20th century literary movement, specifically in poetry and painting, that sought to express the subjective emotional experience rather than narrating the objective reality. Therefore, this particular expressionistic tendency was subjective. But it is not the subjective in the romantic trend of finding a spiritual significance of self and the higher self. This subjective technique used to portray the character's mental state, psychological dilemma, internal truth through strong emotional expressions, often representing it in painting through vibrant colors. As you can see, vibrant colors are used, and we can see how the character expressing his or her intense emotion. Here gender is not explicit, whether it is a man or a woman. Now this is another technique of modern writing, where the gender binaries are always blurred. The binary between real and fantasy is always blurred. The binary between fair and dark, good and evil are always blurred. So we cannot exactly identify from this photo that it is a man or a woman. We can identify a human being probably is trying to resist something with lot of pain. Okay. And that psychological dilemma, anxiety, is portrayed through the vibrant colors here. Now the colors represent the different aspects of the psychological conflict, and this is how the subjectivity is represented in the modernistic writing, which is very much different from the romantic one. The romantic one used to represent the subjectivity through their understanding of a higher realm, of the self and other, of a spiritual entity. That the modernist used to represent the subjectivity through the individual struggle for existence, not only in terms of the society, but also how an individual struggle for existence within his or her own psychological space, how an individual tries to cope up with intense emotion, tries to resist and face the conflicts. And all these ideas are represented through the use of this bright, vibrant colors. Okay. Expressionist writers often use fragmented narratives. As you can see that there is a fragmented picture, multiple colors, we cannot see exactly where are the hands, but through this fragmented picture we can understand one thing, that somebody is in pain. Okay, so this particular pain, this particular image, the themes of alienation, spiritual crisis, and often the social criticism is represented in the expressionistic literature. The literary works of Franz Kafka, George Kaiser, August Strindberg are frequently cited as crucial examples of this movement. Okay. Next, absurdism. Now you can see the picture. Can we find out any meaning? Now this is the essence of postmodernism. Postmodernism cares a damn to find out meaning. They believe that human existence is exactly like this. Hodgepodge, absurd, meaningless. This is the human existence. Now this picture sums up human existence. Okay, that we have no face, we have no definite identity, we have no civilization, we have no culture, we have no meaning itself. Okay, nothing. Okay, and late modernism, postmodernism used to celebrate this part of absurdism. So what is absurdism? Absurdism was a literary movement between 1940 and 1960 by certain European and American dramatists who believe in the existential philosophy of Albert Camus. Okay, who made it in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. And the absurdists believe that human situation is essentially absurd and devoid of purpose. Okay, and therefore in the absurdist writings, especially in dramas, we can find the absurdist writings lack any structural cohesion. There is no structure. Where the characters perform frantically, they try to act that they are busy, but we find out they are busy for nothing. Okay, their action indicates chaos and purposelessness. And this is exactly what they want to make us understand, that life itself is chaotic, it's purposeless. As we can see in Waiting for Godot, how Vladimir and Estragon, they are acting nonsense throughout the play. And through this nonsense, we can understand they are representing the human condition, that our trying to find out the meaning in this world itself is insignificant. Because there is no fixed meaning in the world. The meanings are constantly changing, are arbitrary. And like the puppets, we human beings have to act accordingly in order to justify our existence as a kind of a social animal. Okay, so postmodernism used to depict this absurd existence of human beings through the play, especially of the theatre of the absurd, which I will discuss elaborately in my upcoming video. Now, magic realism is another literary style of late modern and postmodern, in which through the realistic setting we can see the fantastical or mythical elements. Okay, and means it's not exactly a fantastical novel. In a realistic setting, in a realistic character, we can find out a fantastical or mythical element which blurs the binary between the real and the fantastical, and rather creates a unique blending of the two. Okay, now see this particular picture. When we see from here, we can find out these are the pillars of a bridge. When we come near to it, we find out that the pillars were made with human beings. Okay, this is magic realism. Now, what does this picture try to implicate? This picture tries to implicate the essential human condition, that fantasy and reality are a part of human life. So how we can depict it in a binary way? The example of binary of magic realism includes Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, etc. And probably I just want to give an example of the movie like PK, where you can see the realistic character, the realistic setting, okay, the real life. But we see the world from PK's perspective. Now, who is PK? He's supposedly an alien. So here we can see the fantastical element is incorporated into a real life character, real life setting. And through PK's eyes, we are actually seeing our own world, which is so hypocrite, which is so one-sided, which is so biased and prejudiced. Okay, so this is the uniqueness of magic realism, where the fantastical elements are incorporated into the real life setting to present the uniqueness of life, that life cannot be real, life cannot be fantasy, but a blending of both. So this is how modern and postmodern wants to capture the reality in its actual essence. That reality cannot be linear, reality cannot be static, reality cannot be fixed. It is always in flux, it is always moving, it is always multi-generic. Okay. So this is how I am ending this video for today, otherwise it will be too much lengthy. So in the next video I will be doing the modernistic movements and then the modernistic literature. If you like this video, then please do share, subscribe and comment. I will attach the study material in the description box as well as in the comment section so that it will help you. Thank you.